Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar where we are going to be talking with you a little bit more about the Implicit Bias workbook. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to give you an overview of the workbook and just to be able to walk you through the different sections, including the different ways where you might be able to use it. I want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Taquelia Washington, and I am the creator of this workbook. As you're reading through, you're going to be able to learn a little bit more about me in the preface section, including seeing my picture. And so if you're curious about who's talking to you, feel free to scroll down and you'll see my face and get a better idea of not only what I look like, but also in this preface section, I share with you a little bit about my story so that you can get to know not only me, but also the lens in which I am using as I write this workbook. Starting with the table of contents, you can see the breakdown of what's going to be included in the workbook that you have in front of you. And during our time together over the next 10-15 minutes, I'm just going to be using the time to go through each section and just to notice some things with you, highlight some areas that might be helpful for you to know about prior to digging deeper into the workbook. First, I want to start off by just talking a little bit about what the purpose is of the workbook. So one of the main purposes of the workbook is to create space for you, the reader, to be able to learn more about the concept of bias, to be able to learn about that not only from a individual state, create an opportunity for you to be able to self-reflect at a deeper level about the idea of bias, as well as the different ways in which you've been socialized to have biases. One of the things that you're going to note as you're reading the preface section is this idea that everybody has implicit bias. Everyone including you, everyone including me. For me, there's something actually reassuring about that, normalizing the idea that we all have inherent biases. It is something that sometimes can be really hard to not only talk about, but to also reflect on. And so for me to know that this is actually something that all of us have internalized in some way, shape, or form takes a little bit of the stigma out of it and allows me to be able to really look at maybe some of the parts of me that are a little bit more of my shadow or darker side of myself. Particularly for those of us that are helping professionals, not only is this type of self-reflective work important for us as just human beings, but it's really crucial for us as helping professionals to do the type of work that we're encouraging you to do in this workbook, because our own implicit biases impact those that we're working with in the community. And in order for us to really make our implicit biases more explicit, we have to do the level of self-reflective work that we're encouraging you to do in the workbook. And it's through making our implicit biases more explicit that we can actually have conscious choice around how we act or not act toward people. But in order to be able to do that, we have to first make it more explicit. I want to also highlight in this section that this workbook, there's a couple of different ways that you might choose to go throughout the workbook. Some might choose to do it as an individual exercise. So maybe you read it and you take some of the questions and you journal and really go through your own personal process around it. Another way that you might choose to engage in the workbook is with your colleagues or with a friendship community, where you not only do a self-reflection piece, but you also talk with each other about some of your responses, that you learn and grow with each other in community. Either way, both of them are very valuable experiences, but you might find yourself being drawn to do it by yourself and or in community. I encourage either or. So after you're done reading the preface, it starts off by giving you some reflection questions just to start to think about. So before you even start to dive deeper, what is important for you? Why is it important for you to explore your own implicit bias? How is that connected to the work that you do? How might exploring your own implicit bias help you not only personally, but also professionally? And as we're going to start to talk about shortly in the next section, it's also really important at this point that you start to think about what are some of the ways in which you can self regulate or calm yourself if you find yourself starting to get activated as you're reading the workbook. In this next section, we actually provide you two different types of grounding exercises that you might find to be really helpful if you are finding yourself being activated. And I want to clarify, what do I mean when I say activated? So as you're going to find, as you're reading through not only the workbook, but you're starting to self-reflect on some of the questions that we're offering you, there might be a way in which you might find yourself feeling a wide range of feelings in this process. Some of the areas that you're going to be reflecting on might bring up a wide range of feelings for you. Sometimes those feelings might include sadness, sometimes anger, sometimes frustration, sometimes it could be happy memories as well. But we just really want to make sure that you have the tools and the skills to be able to self-regulate through whatever experiences you might have or might come up for you as you're reading this. This is not only a really important skill for you to have as you're reading through this workbook and you're going through the questions, but this is also a really important transferable skill for you to have as a provider as well. As we already know, even as we're sitting in the community and listening to the stories that our clients or participants may share with us, that in and of itself can bring up a wide range of feelings for us. Those feelings are natural and normal, and we want to invite those feelings in our body. And it's also really important that we can stay grounded, rooted, and connected as we're going through and holding space for others. So finding tools for yourself to learn to ground and self-regulate is going to be a really important part of your process. And so if you don't already have your own practices, or if you're looking for additional tools to add to that practice, definitely check out these exercises that we have. The first one you see here in front of you, and the next one is a much longer script that is a form of self-regulation for yourself. After you're done doing your grounding exercises, there's space here for you to do some additional journaling around what may be coming up for you, even as you practice the grounding techniques. The next section gives you some basic terminology of different words that you may see throughout the workbook. Some of these terms are terms that you may already be familiar with. Some of them may be very new terms to you. And so if you come across any of these words in the workbook, feel free to come back to the terminology section to read a little bit more about the definition so that you're really understanding the context in which we're using the words. Next, we start to dive into what is bias and why is it important to talk about. In this section, we are starting to make the distinction between implicit bias and explicit bias. This focus of the workbook really is on implicit bias, but in order for us to really start to understand implicit bias, we want to make sure that we are able to distinguish that from explicit bias. And so in this section, it really is more of an intellectual framing to give you more knowledge about what these terms mean. And then at the end of that section, you're going to find further lines for you to just to continue in your self-reflection process, which is really part of the main intention of the work that we're doing together. Next up, you are going to see a section that's going to start to highlight what are some of the macro level influences of how we're socialized to have bias, particularly having grown up, if you're someone who have grown up here in the United States, these are systems of oppression that are really prevalent here in the United States. If you grew up in other countries, some of these ideologies or systems of oppression are also relevant to other experiences that you may have had in other countries, but this is specifically focusing on here in the United States. And it's really important for us to really look at, for those of us that have been socialized under this society, there are very strong systems of oppression that have corresponding ideologies to them that are oftentimes invisible to us because, in many ways, they become the fabric of our society. They become the air in which we breathe, the water in which we swim in. And if we're not mindful of really kind of deconstructing that and really looking at how have we been socialized, how have our socialization led us to have biases toward others, both explicitly and implicitly, it really is deeply connected in so many ways. So, this section is going to give you an intellectual understanding of what some of those systems of oppression are and how they are deeply connected to implicit or internalized biases. And after you're done reading that section, there's additional space for you to reflect. You're going to find, as I mentioned, lots of thoughts you're going to have as you're reading this. Be very for you. So this is an opportunity for you to capture some of those thoughts. But as you're reading, even from an intellectual space, I want you to not only be noticing what are your thoughts, but remember to tap into your body. Remember to tap into like what feelings are coming up for me in reading this material. What energy is coming up for me as I'm reading this. Tap into that, reflect on that, journal around that so that you can really capture your range of experience as you're working with this workbook. From there, we start to talk even more explicitly about explicit bias. In the previous section, we talked about that from an intellectual space, and now we're starting to shift into from more of a reflective space, looking at more from a process reflective space. What are the explicit biases that you know that you already hold about other people? In this purple section down here, it gives you some additional guiding questions for you to think about to help you to start to reflect on explicit bias that you might have. So, for example, the first question: what do you currently know about areas where you hold bias? Areas may include, but are not limited to, racial ethnic groups, genders, sexual orientations, people of different abilities, classes, etc. So, really giving yourself time to deeply reflect and be honest with yourself about not only this question, but the other questions as well. And as I was mentioning a short time ago, this tends to be a really taboo area for us to talk about. It can be really taboo or stigmatizing to allow ourselves to admit that we have especially explicit bias. But by denying that or by pretending that those biases aren't there, we're actually not doing ourselves a service. And we're definitely not doing a service to those that we serve in the community. By allowing ourselves to be honest with ourselves, honest with how we've internalized a lot of these beliefs that we're surrounded around, that's one of the first steps in breaking the pattern. If we can allow ourselves to be honest with ourselves about how we feel about the thoughts that we're having, we can then start to disrupt that and we can start to make a conscious effort to relearn some of the patterns or things that we might have learned through our various upbringing. And so I just want to continue to encourage you to be honest, to really take the time out to reflect deeply on these questions, both individually, and then if you're doing this workbook as a group, taking the time to spend some time thinking and talking with each other about some of these areas as well. If you are doing this in a group, you really want to make sure that you are setting some really strong ground rules and group agreements with each other so that each person can feel safe, really being honest with each other about what feelings are coming up for them, what thoughts are coming up for them, etc. And again, there's some additional lines for you to journal around this. And now we move into really the implicit bias section. So from prior to this point, we have explored explicit bias. We've explored systems of oppression and how that has influenced us. And now we're really starting to get into the section where we're really starting to reflect more on what are the internalized biases, what are the more implicit forms of biases that we might embody or hold within ourselves. So this section actually gives you a link to a online test that you can take that helps to give you more insight around your implicit biases that you might hold. I'm going to be showing you a screenshot shortly to give you an idea of what that online test looks like. Before I do that, I just want to draw your attention to page 18. There is one self-reflection question in here that asks you to reflect on, it's not in that section, I think maybe it's up here somewhere, but it asks you to basically to reflect on what do you think your results might show. And so that it gives you that opportunity to think about it before you actually take the test. So I want to encourage you to do that prior to clicking on the link. But now I am going to stop this screen for a moment, and I'm going to go to the online test that I'm going to be asking each of you to do. So let's go back a little bit. Perfect. So when you first put the link in your browser, it's going to take you to this screen, Project Implicit. If you're interested to learn more about Project Implicit, there's a little bit of information in the workbook about who created this test. It's actually probably the most widespread and commonly used online test to help people to tap into their implicit bias. There's others that exist, but this is the most common one that folks take. It's the one that has the most research and evidence that backs it up. So you're going to see the screen. If you want to register here, you can. When I do it, I often go to this section here and log on as a guest. So I'm going to click here. And then it's going to tell you all about like data privacy, give you some disclaimers. So make sure that you read through that in depth and that you're okay with clicking down here, the I wish to proceed part. And once you do that, it is going to take you to options around different types of tests that you might take, depending on the areas of biases that you're interested in exploring within yourself. And so there is a list of them to choose from. Once you figure out which ones you want to take, you will just click here on the blue square, or I guess that's more of a rectangle, and it will take you to the test from there. I'm not going to actually click on any just because I don't want to give you a preview into the exact tests that they're going to be giving you. A lot of it is going to be relying on how quickly you're clicking on different items. And so I don't want to give you a sneak preview of that, but I wanted to just at least familiarize you with what it looks like once you come to the link. So I'm going to now switch back to the workbook. And we will move on. And so that section is all about the online test, having you take it. Once you take it, there's some further reflection questions that you can do based on what your results of the different tests were. And after you're done with that, there is this additional section that just gives you more space to think even more deeply about your implicit biases, including the different ways in which you have been socialized. So this in some ways connects to the systems of oppression section, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. The implicit bias test, they're standardized tests in some ways, and so it can give you one dimension of information that might be really useful for you in unpacking your implicit bias. And I also believe that's only one dimension of it. Really helpful for us to really unpack the different parts of our identity and become extremely curious with ourselves about how we've been shaped in our identities. What have we learned about our identities in society? What have we learned about other people's identity in society? And so this section is designed to help you to think very deeply about that. There's some guiding questions here that I am asking you to reflect on. These guiding questions I am encouraging you to use in the context of this identity wheel. So this identity wheel is a new tool that I've been using. It's called the diversity wheel. If you're interested, you can find a blank copy of it really easily online. But it's been a really useful tool for me in thinking about different dimensions of identity. It is non-inclusive, meaning there are many other types of cultural identities out there that aren't included in this chart, but it does give us a really good starting point. So what I'd like to encourage you to do in this section is to pick as many of these identities as feels relevant to you and go through each of these reflection questions based on each identity that you choose. And so this might be a section that might take you much longer to do, depending on how many parts of your identity you're wanting to explore. Take your time with it. Don't rush through it. This is something that you're probably going to be doing over the course of time. You know, it's probably not something that you're going to be able to get through in 10 minutes. And in fact, I probably wouldn't even encourage you to try to get through it in 10 minutes, right? Allow yourself to reflect deeply. Allow yourself to really think, remembering to tap into your body, noticing what's coming up for you, noticing the energy, the feelings, etc., and just giving yourself spaciousness to really reflect. It's through this process of reflection, added to tests like the online implicit bias tests, added to the other sections of the workbook, that really help us to make these implicit biases more explicit. And that is ultimately part of the work that we're trying to do together. And in the last section, it talks about what do you now do with that? So now that you've gone through this process, now that you've really thought about your implicit biases, you've made some of them more explicit, what do you then do from there? And this section just gives you some like basic bullet points of where to start. Once you have made it explicit, you can recognize within yourself when you start to have stereotypical thinking. Once you catch yourself having stereotypical or biased thinking, you can catch yourself in that moment, and then you can you can then immediately challenge that thought, right? Catch it in the moment, challenge that thought. And then as an important step after you challenge that thought, it's about replacing that thought, right? Maybe what you've learned through this workbook exploration is that maybe there's parts of you that needs more exposure to other identity groups. Maybe you need to do more education for yourself around other groups of people, other identity groups. And so the more that you can educate yourself, the more that you can grow and expand, the easier it becomes in replacing these biased thought patterns that sometimes creep into our head without us even realizing it. I want to name that this in and of itself can be a lifelong process. This workbook is one tool for you to use to help you along your path. And there's many other tools out there that are going to also be helpful for you. I want to encourage you to just continue to do your work, to use this workbook as a tool in that work, but to know that this is a lifelong journey. This is a lifelong journey that I am incredibly committed to, and it's a lifelong journey that I really want us to be in together. And as I mentioned in the preface, our world deserves that. Our world deserves for us to do this type of work. And in particular, as a part of that world, the communities that we serve, the clients, the participants that we're working so hard to provide healing spaces for, they need us to do this work. And so I thank you for being willing and open to engage with yourself in this way. And I really encourage you to use the workbook as it's intended, and hopefully it can be a guide for you in this way.